Jeremy Bamber was called the UK's most prolific serial unaliver, but just this past year, there has been some new evidence revealed that could potentially show that he was wrongfully convicted. But there's a lot of people that don't know about his story, and that's because it took place in the 80s. So let's go back and talk about what happened. So Jeremy was adopted when he was a young child to a very wealthy family that happened to live on a farm in the UK. And he also had a sister that was also adopted into the same family. And her name was Sheila, and she also had two young twin boys named Daniel and Nicholas. But in 1986, when Jeremy was 25 years old, he was convicted of taking the life of his entire family, which included both of his parents, his sister Sheila, and both of her sons. Now, initially, authorities actually believed that Sheila was the one responsible for the massacre, and that ultimately, after taking the lives of her family, she then decided to take her own life as well. And the reason they initially believed this was because she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And just a few months before the entire thing happened, she had actually spent some time in a psychiatric hospital. And she was undergoing a lot of issues at this time, mainly because her parents had told her that she should give up her children and commit herself to a hospital because she was no longer fit enough to take care of them. Which, according to people that knew her, this was her biggest fear because she absolutely loved her kids. But then there was a very big twist in the case. Jeremy's girlfriend at the time implicated Jeremy in the massacre. She told authorities that Jeremy had told her that he had been planning the entire thing for years before it happened. Now, initially, she said that he had hired a hitman to carry out the hit, but when authorities interviewed the hitman in question, he later came forward and said that he had a solid alibi, which was proven to be true. And when authorities went back to his girlfriend to ask her about this, she then changed her story and said that Jeremy was the one that did it himself. And when authorities tried to understand why Jeremy would do something like this to his own family, it was suspected that he did this because he was set to receive a very large inheritance. Jeremy was arrested and he would go to trial in 1986, and then he was convicted and set to spend life in prison. But now, as Jeremy is 64 years old, new evidence has potentially come forward after an investigation was done by the New Yorker. An investigative reporter tracked down a former police officer that was on duty that night named Nick Milbank. Now, this police officer gave audio testimony claiming he heard strange noises in a phone call received at 911. He claimed to have heard muffled speech or some sort of noise that could have been a door that was opening and closing, or even a chair that may have been moved. And he also stated that this phone call came from inside the farmhouse at approximately 6:09 a.m. And if this is actually true, it means that someone was still alive inside of the family home around 6 a.m., which means that the prosecution's original case takes a huge hit because they claim that by that time, everyone in the home was no longer alive. And at that specific moment, Jeremy was already standing outside of the family home with police officers, meaning that if this entire thing is true, it gives him an alibi, essentially stating that he could not have been the one to have committed the crime. Which could also mean that Jeremy's story of what happened could actually be true, which points to his sister Sheila. Now, Jeremy claimed that his father called him early that morning around 3:30 a.m. saying that his sister had gone absolutely berserk with one of the rifles he owned. But the prosecution argued that this did not make sense because if this were true, why would his father call him and not the authorities if this was happening? But in addition to the new evidence that was uncovered, there's also reason to believe that the crime scene may have been contaminated. But as for Jeremy right now, his future is still up in the air. We don't know where this is heading with the new evidence just yet. But like always, let me know what you guys think. Do you think he was the one responsible for what happened to his family? Or was it his sister? Or was it someone completely different? This is another very bizarre case. Because what do you mean a young woman gets her life taken from her on a beach in the middle of the day and no one sees or hears anything? In this photo is a young woman named Victoria Cafasso, and in 1995, that's exactly what happened to her. So Victoria was born in England, but her father was Italian and he spent a lot of time working there. And she spent the majority of her childhood growing up in Italy along with her younger sister. And as a result, she did have dual citizenship between the UK and Italy, and also spoke English, Italian, and French. Now, she was a very young and bright woman, so much so that she was ready to take on law as her career. However, right before she was about to start, she decided to defer her studies. And instead, she wanted to go to England to visit her grandmother, and then she had made plans to travel to Tasmania to visit a cousin. And on October 6th of 1995, she arrived in Tasmania, greeted by her cousin and a friend of his that was from Sydney, Australia. Now, her cousin lived in an area called Beaumaris Beach. And on their way to his home, they decided to stop by a lookout that oversaw the Beaumaris Beach. And it was here where she also met 3 other people that he happened to know. Now, even though she was on holiday here, she had only met her cousin a couple of times beforehand, and she didn't really venture much out into the public. All she really did was go for a few walks on the beach. And that's also what she did on October 11th. It was the morning around 9 a.m. and she was reported as going out for a walk on the beach that day. And people did come forward saying that they saw her tanning around 10 a.m. on the beach. And we would later hear from police that they were able to confirm that at least 50 people had been on the beach that morning around the same time as Victoria. And it wasn't until 1:30 p.m. that afternoon that her lifeless body was discovered in the shallow water. Police estimated that she passed away somewhere between 11:30 a.m. and 12:30 that afternoon, and she was found partially undressed, and there were clearly signs of a struggle. But the worst part of it all is that she had suffered 17 stab wounds. They did find several of her belongings about 50 meters away on the beach, but there were several things that were never recovered, including the lower portion of her bikini, nor was her towel or the weapon used to commit this heinous crime. However, they were able to determine that she had initially been able to defend herself from the attack because she was hit with something heavy. And whatever this was, it was hard and heavy enough to break 3 of her teeth. But very early on, authorities were criticized because they did not corner off the area fast enough. Apparently, the investigation was poorly done. And throughout all of the interviews that police did, they were able to determine the amount of people that were there that morning, but surprisingly, no one saw or heard anything. And tragically, Victoria's father passed away just 6 weeks after she passed away, never getting the answers that he was looking for. And the case went cold fairly quickly. It wasn't until decades later that a clue was released by the authority. It was a photo of this car here. Now, this is not the photo that was at the crime scene. It's a model of a car that was similar of one that was seen that day. They described it as being a light-colored Subaru station wagon with a young man driving it who appeared to have kind of like a surfer look. They then said that this car was spotted at the beach that day, but that many locals had also seen it around the area in the days leading up to what happened. And as for the man in question, they described him as being about 20 years old or in his early 20s, being tall, slim, and pretty fit. And someone would come forward later saying that they did see a man matching the description running across the beach. However, they did not see anything else. But because this is all authorities really have to go on, they're hoping that someone remembers seeing a car similar to this that day, and that maybe the car is still being held at someone's home in the area, even if it's not being used anymore. And over the years, many of the same witnesses were re-interviewed. They were even brought back to the crime scene to see if they could remember any other details, but no new information came forward. And tragically, that's where the case remains to this day. If you have any information about what happened to Victoria Cafasso that day in 1995, contact the authorities. I will put the information in the description. This is probably one of the weirdest disappearances I've ever heard of. Because what do you mean a 6', 19-year-old man just disappears in broad daylight in a quiet neighborhood? This is the disappearance of Jason Jolkowski. Let's get into it. Now, Jason was a very nice young man. His parents described him as being shy, but he was also very smart. He was just a very kind person. No one would ever think that he would have any sort of enemy or anyone that would want to hurt him. And at the time of his disappearance, he was working 2 part-time jobs while saving up money, getting ready to go back to school. But on June 13th of 2001, Jason received a phone call from one of his part-time jobs asking him if he could come into work that day. Now, initially, Jason was unsure if he could make it into work because his car was actually in a repair shop. But he did his best to figure out a solution, which he did, and that was to call one of his co-workers to ask for a ride. So he calls his co-worker and they agree to meet at a local high school, which was approximately 11 minutes of a walk away from his home. And the reason they agreed to meet at the high school was because it was popular, it was a landmark area, and apparently Jason was not the best at giving direction. Now, like I said earlier, the high school was only about 11 minutes in walking time away from his home. And the streets surrounding both of these locations were all just very quiet residential streets. Now, he was supposed to meet his co-worker at the high school at approximately 11 a.m. And the last person to see Jason was his neighbor, who spotted him out in front of his driveway around 10:45 a.m. because he was helping his younger brother take out the trash. And then he saw him leave the driveway and walk in the direction of the high school. But then 11 o'clock came and went, and his co-worker was at the high school waiting for him. And when Jason failed to arrive at the appointed time, she called his home around 11:15, 11:30 a.m., and they told her that he was not there. And when authorities would later check the security footage at the high school, it was confirmed that Jason never made it to the high school at all, which meant that somewhere between his home and the high school, he just disappeared. Now, unfortunately, Jason's parents thought that they had to wait 24 hours before reporting anyone missing, which was not true. But even with those 24 hours, the authorities did not take this case seriously as they should have. Initially, they thought that Jason was just another teenage runaway, and they told his family that he would just make his way back home. And as a result, they did not start investigating his case until 10 days after he disappeared. Even so, his family knew that he would not just disappear on his own. There was nothing missing from his room except for his cell phone and about $60 in cash. The authorities interviewed his family, his friends, neighbors, but nobody had any sort of explanation as to what happened to him. The only lead they got was from that one neighbor who saw him walking around 10:45 a.m. And after he disappeared, there was zero activity on his bank account or his cell phone. And his parents also said that Jason was just not the type of person to have any sort of interest in partying or essentially getting himself into the wrong type of crowd. Even the authorities were at a complete loss as to how Jason could have disappeared without a single witness or trace, with one of the officers saying it was the most baffling case he had ever seen in 30 years. And over the years, they have released age-progressed photos of what Jason could potentially look like if he's still alive today. And as for theories as to what could have happened, there are several of them. The most popular one, and the one that his family seems to believe, is that he could have potentially been lured into a vehicle or a home on his way to the school. And then after that, they could only assume to believe that he had his life taken from him. Another theory suggests that he could have possibly been the victim of a hit and run. But I find this to be a little bit hard to believe, because if this were the case, surely someone would have seen something or at least heard something. And if it were a hit and run, would this person have had enough time to take his body, put it in the trunk without anyone seeing or hearing anything? Which brings me back to the original theory, and the one that seems to be the most popular, that he trusted someone and got into a car or someone's home. But the one thing that I can't wrap my head around is that if this is true, why would someone target a man that is 6'1"? Surely he would have been able to overpower anyone that was trying to do harm to him. Which leads to the possibility that maybe the person that took him was someone familiar to Jason, someone that he trusted, someone that he could have potentially known from the area, someone that he didn't think would do anything to him. But I will say that authorities also searched all of the homes in the neighborhood and it did not turn up any evidence, so we're back to square one. So if you know anything about what happened to Jason in 2001, contact this number here.